Steve here. Let's take a trip back in time to the 1990s. Now, this was a decade that kicked off with a jobless recovery and a war, but it ended in a speculative madness the likes of which nobody had ever seen. This is the story of the dot-com boom.
You see, to get a handle on the 90s, you got to wrap your head around this one single idea. The old rule book, it was thrown out the window. It stopped being about who is actually buying your product. No, it was about how many people were just looking at your website. Eyeballs. That was the new currency.
Just take a look at this. Over on the left, you've got the very bedrock of finance for 100 years, right? Profit, customers, real tangible value. And on the right, that's the new religion coming out of Silicon Valley. Burn rate, eyeballs, potential. It was a complete upending of everything we knew, and it was setting the stage for absolute mania.
So, what lit the fuse? Every wildfire needs a spark. And for the dot-com bubble, that spark came on one single day in the summer of '95.
Picture it. August 9th, 1995. The market is just kind of getting back on its feet after the Gulf War. And on this day, this little company called Netscape decides it's going to go public. Now get this, it had no profits, not a dime. In fact, it didn't even have a clear path to making any money.
And the man behind it all? Mark Andreessen. Just a kid, barely 24 years old. But he wasn't selling a product, you see. He was selling a story, a grand vision of the future. And in doing so, he was about to prove to the entire world that in this new economy, fundamentals were for dinosaurs.
The stock didn't just climb, it went ballistic. It more than doubled on its very first day. All across the financial world, jaws were on the floor. This was the Big Bang. The starting gun had been fired.
And the message was crystal clear. That old playbook, the one built on boring stuff like balance sheets and earnings, it was officially dead. The only thing that mattered now was the promise, the potential of what a company could be, no matter how crazy or far-fetched it seemed.
So the fire was lit. All it needed was fuel. And while a few sane people tried to douse the flames, a whole lot of others, well, whether they meant to or not, they just kept pouring gasoline on it.
Right in the eye of this hurricane was the chairman of the Federal Reserve, Alan Greenspan. In December of '96, he gives this big speech, and he asks the market this one simple question with these now famous words. They called him the Maestro, and this was supposed to be his great warning.
And how did the market respond to the Maestro? Well, it dipped for a couple of hours, and then it pretty much just laughed in his face. For the next 3 years, the Nasdaq didn't just climb, it went vertical. It went parabolic. Greenspan's warning wasn't a brake pedal, it was just a little speed bump on the highway to the moon.
And at the same time, you had this new class of high priests emerging from Wall Street. Analysts, people like Mary Meeker, Henry Blodgett. They weren't just analyzing companies, they were anointing them. They'd issue these insane, hyper-bullish price targets that weren't really predictions, they were more like marching orders for a market that was just desperate for its next hit.
By 1999, the mania was total. I mean, absolute. Being cautious was for cowards, and fundamentals, that was just a punchline to a joke nobody was telling anymore. This was the absolute peak of the absurdity.
Let me tell you about the key metric of the era. It was a little something called burn rate. Now, to any sane person, burn rate is just what it sounds like. How fast your company is burning through cash. It's a 5-alarm fire. But back then, in the dot-com world, a high burn rate was a badge of honor. It meant you were aggressive, you were ambitious, you were growing.
And the stories, they were everywhere. You had Pets.com spending millions of dollars on a Super Bowl ad with a sock puppet, even though they were losing money on every single bag of dog food they shipped. People were quitting their jobs, good jobs, to become day traders, just staring at a screen all day long, absolutely convinced they'd found the secret to getting rich without ever having to work again.
But here's the thing, the simple, brutal truth that everyone just seemed to forget. A business, at its core, has to make money. It just has to. Anything else? Well, it's just a hobby, an incredibly expensive venture capital-funded hobby.
And that, of course, brings us to the end of the story. The crash, the hangover, and the lessons. Well, the lessons from that time are still echoing all the way to today.
So why are we digging all this up today on Thursday, March 12, 2026? Because while history might not repeat itself, it sure does rhyme. And let me tell you, the echoes of the dot-com bubble, they are all around us.
Now, it wasn't a total loss.
To be fair, the trillions of dollars that just went up in smoke during the bubble, it did lay the foundation for the internet we use today. All that fiber optic cable, the server farms, this always-on culture we have, it was all forged in the fires of the 90s.
But the real lesson, the one that is absolutely timeless, is this. Sooner or later, the promise of eyeballs has to become the reality of earnings. A good story can only take you so far before reality comes knocking on your door.
Because in the end, every single one of these speculative bubbles runs on something called the greater fool theory. The belief that no matter how much you overpay for something, you can always find a greater fool to buy it from you for even more. The problem is, eventually, you run out of fools. This is Steve. Check your fundamentals.